My name is David Seljak. I'm the director of the center. And welcome to the 2005-2006 Somerville Lecture, part of our annual lecture series. This year, the title of our lecture series is Amazing Church, celebrating the changes in the church in the last 50 years. And not only the specific changes, but the fact that we are a church that is ever in need of reform and ever looking out to reform. There are seats available. There's actually two here in the front row, which, school and church, it's the same. If you come late, the punishment is you have to sit up front. And as I said, tonight, this year's lecture series is called Amazing Church. I stole this title from Gregory Baum's latest book, and that book is available for sale, actually, at the Woodsworth table. And tonight's lecture is Stalking the Holy, also based on a book by Michael Higgins, and that book was supposed to be on sale tonight. We had arranged this all. We had worked with the publisher. We had worked with CBC, because Stalking the Holy is also a CBC broadcast on the IDEAS program. And CBC, of course, had a little bit of labor trouble, in case you might have noticed, in the fall. Anansi Press had a little bit of publishing problems. So the book will be out in 2 weeks. You may pre-order the book at the Wordsworth table. And the CBC series will air later this year. And we will, in our email announcements, we will make sure that you know exactly when that is. For those of you standing at the back, there are plenty of seats up here in the front. To my left, your right. Please find a spot. You see a man's hand up, and follow that man's hand. He has 2 chairs right there. It's wonderful to see so many of you out this evening. What I would like to start, actually, what I would like to start us off by doing is many people arrived here to get some seats at about 7 o'clock. So what I'd like to do is I'd like everyone to stand up, and I would like you to greet your neighbor front and back, as you are so used to doing. So please rise. All right, if you can come back to order. It's great to stretch your legs, but that's all I want you to do. The only part I don't like about that exercise is the fact that I ask you to sit down again, because people start such lively conversations so quickly, it seems a shame to interrupt them. I have been given a couple of announcements. I want to make them now. One is a very exciting event. Jean Vanier is coming to London, Ontario in February, and we have a number of these little brochures. Carol Person has them at her table, and if you're interested in that talk, it's February 3, 4, and 5 in London, Ontario. If you give Carol your email address, I'll make sure that you get all of the information to hear Jean Vanier. He'll be giving a public talk on Saturday, February the 4th at the London Convention Centre, and all of the information for getting tickets to that event are on that brochure. As well, the Mount Carmel Spiritual Center presents a symposium with Dr. Michael Higgins, tonight's speaker, and it is called Stalking the Holy. And it is if today's lecture whets your appetite, there is a whole weekend talking about holiness and other such issues. This flyer is available again at Carol Person's table in the foyer, so please help yourselves. As well, at the back we have, of course, the Wordsworth books. People are here again selling books of interest. And we also have a table staffed by the sponsors of tonight's lecture, the Catholic Register. The Somerville lecture was established by the Catholic Register in conjunction with St. Jerome's a number of years ago. And we have had a series of just spectacularly successful events. Each event has been extremely well attended, both here in Waterloo, but also in Toronto. And the speakers have been lively and engaging, and we expect tonight's speakers to be no less. So you may pick up, free of charge, a copy of the register. I thought it'd be best if people picked them up on the way out, because you don't want everyone with a newspaper on their lap. You know, the talk gets a little slow in the middle, and all of a sudden half the audience is reading. And But I don't know, many of you probably might find also, I felt that many of you might think that because Michael Higgins does so much work with the media, especially with the election of the Pope, he was on CTV television, CBC television, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, so many of these outlets so frequently, that you might think that the title of this last week's Catholic Register was chosen specifically for him. The title is Media, Religion, and the Lunatic Fringe. I couldn't make this up, folks. But Joe Sinisak assures me there is not a word about Michael Higgins in the entire issue. And so I'm going to be as brief as I always am tonight. No, I really mean brief. And simply allow Joe Sinisak of the Catholic Register to introduce tonight's speaker. But before I do, I just want to thank the Catholic Register for sponsoring the Somerville Lectures in Christianity and Communications over these last few years. And it's been especially Joe who has spearheaded that sponsorship and who receives our speakers with such warmth in Toronto and provides a lecture venue for them. The lectures in Toronto have been very successful, but I might add, not as successful as the ones here. Joe Sinisak.
There's something about coming to Waterloo, I think, that always makes this a special evening. And we always have such warm, wonderful discussions and talks in the hallway back afterwards, and beforehand. It's good to see so many people that I've known over the years. And so it was a great pleasure, actually, 5 years ago, to work out how we were going to sponsor this lecture with the Catholic Center for Cultural Experience, with David and the other great people at St. Jerome. And so it's great to be here once again. I've been given the great pleasure, though a daunting pleasure, I have to add, to introduce Dr. Michael Higgins. I say daunting because to introduce someone whom everybody already knows is surely a challenge. I'm sure most of you in this room probably know Dr. Michael Higgins better than you know me. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So anyway, consider my remarks less an introduction than an explanation of why we wanted Michael to present our 5th annual Henry Somerville Lecture in Christianity and Communications. First of all, it's not just because he's a hot property these days, and he is a hot property if not necessarily the lunatic fringe. I made that up, by the way. You may be aware, in fact, I'm sure you're aware, that he was nominated by his students here at St. Jerome's as their choice for Best Lecture in a province-wide competition sponsored by TV Ontario. And then Michael was subsequently chosen out of more than 350 nominees as one of the 10 finalists, and has duly given his best lecture on TV Ontario a few weeks ago. And we now eagerly await the announcement about the winner, which will be released on November 12th. I think we can take it from this. If you have not heard Michael speak before, you can be sure that he is both an entertaining and informative lecturer. So that's one good reason. And it's also not just because he has a new book, as David Seljak mentioned earlier, Stalking the Holy in Pursuit of Saint-Making. All the same, this topic, investigating the fascinating, if opaque, process by which the Roman Catholic Church recognizes officially its saints, is surely fascinating and worthy of study, not just for Catholics, but for anyone interested in the spiritual life. So that's another good reason. But there's more. The Somerville Lecture, as we envisioned it, strives to present to the public at large some of the best thinking extant on how Christianity connects with modern culture. Our speakers are rooted in the Catholic world, but open to reflection on the larger culture, eager to embrace that which is good and beautiful, and quick to point out that which is soul-destroying and harmful to human dignity. Michael Higgins certainly fits that mold. He is a university administrator, yes, here at St. Jerome's, but he also remains a very active scholar, displaying a lively intellectual curiosity in the Catholic Church and its myriad manifestations in today's world. He has also been, as many of you know, some of you may have been as students, a supremely active teacher as a professor of English and religious studies at St. Jerome's since 1982. But his reach extends far beyond academia. He has written dozens of scripts for CBC Radio's famed IDEAS program and has been a much-sought commentator on things Catholic for various mainstream media, including CTV and Globe and Mail, CBC, as was mentioned earlier, and many others. I was very happy when Michael accepted my invitation to write a monthly column for the Register, which he's been doing now for a couple of years. But he also writes regularly for the Toronto Star and for the Kitchener-Waterloo Record. He has also been a prolific author. Among his many books, aside from tonight's, Heretic Blood, The Spiritual Geography of Thomas Merton, The Jesuit Mystique, The Muted Voice, Religion and the Media, and a national bestseller, Power and Peril, The Catholic Church at the Crossroads, which he co-authored with Doug Letson. Personally, I might add that Michael Higgins has been a trusted advisor, a wonderful source of news about what's happening in the church. Some of you might call it gossip, I suppose, and a dear friend. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Higgins.
Professor Klein coming in late. We'll talk on Monday. I'm going to turn my BlackBerry off because I was just telling my wife, who's here this evening, that I had the most extraordinary event the other day. In fact, it was yesterday. I was lecturing in Detroit, just outside of Detroit, and I had to go across the bridge at Sarnia to Port Huron. It's the John Courtney Murray Newman Center, and it's for the Archdiocese of Detroit and neighboring universities and colleges. And so I had to go across the bridge, and I'm a fairly restive person. I'm not I write about contemplatives, but I have absolutely nothing contemplative about me. So I'm standing on the bridge, and I'm thinking, why? It's an incredible waste of time behind all these trucks and whatnot. So I start to download the BlackBerry and the attachments and whatnot, and I'm not paying attention. And then I suddenly realize that I have to bring the car forward, and I bring it forward, but I bring it so far forward that I exceed the limit. And as a consequence, everybody starts screaming at me. People screaming and running all over the place. And I thought there was somebody behind me, so I look around very pompously, very virtuously, thinking, who did this? And then I realized that the car they're surrounding is my car. And so this was most unpleasant, and I had to explain that I wasn't paying any attention. I was using my BlackBerry. And it introduced a whole component of deep suspicion, which I hope won't exist tonight. And the chief customs officer says to me in somewhat condescending terms, at least somewhat belligerent, he said, so what are you doing coming to the world's greatest country? And I thought, okay, I'm not falling for that one. So I said, well, I'm actually here to see some friends, some chaplains, actually, because I had learned what happens when you tell them you're going to give a lecture. So he said, are you a chaplain? And I said, no, I work in the university, but I'm not a chaplain. So what do you do? What department are you in? And I said, well, I'm not in a department. I'm president of the university. And he said, yes, right. And so you spend a lot of time visiting chaplains, do you? I didn't like the tone of this, so I said, well, I happen to like chaplains. So this was not going anywhere. And then he says, all right, open the trunk. So I said, okay, now the car is a rental. Okay, I have no idea where the trunk is, so I opened the gas cap. So I looked up, I thought, God, could this get any worse? I looked up in the mirror, and I could see the disgust, defining him. So he came up, and he came to the front of the door, and he said, yes, you are a professor. You can go. Well, I was very relieved that he was not sitting in the audience that night, because I had been told, and this has happened several times, never happens when I'm flying into Washington because nobody ever asks you, but I'm told several times when I drive over, don't tell people you're giving a lecture. And I had made the mistake 25 years ago when going to Rochester to give a lecture to say, naively, that I was giving this lecture on the Zen mystical poetry of the later Thomas Merton. Well, I don't know whether it was the Zen part or the mystical part or whatever, but this prompted considerable alarm, and I was taken into an interrogation room. And I thought, good grief, there's no way I can even begin to explain what the heck that Merton's Zen mystical poetry is. So the guy says, you're going to have to explain the content of your lecture, sir. And I said, well, actually, it's on the Trinity. He said, the Trinity? He said, yeah, are there no Americans with competence on the Trinity? And I said, no, the Trinity is a Canadian specialization. So I got out, cheeky fellow that I was, because I thought afterwards, if he had had a degree in religious studies, he would have been able to figure out the BS pretty quickly, and I would have been in deep trouble. But I learned from then on that one lies when you cross the border, and so now I just say I'm visiting friends. I will no longer be able to say, of course, I'm visiting chaplains, because that generates deep suspicion, so I'm visiting friends. So I've got the BlackBerry turned off, and just a few other comments by way of preparation. David kindly alluded to the fact that this is a book that's not out, and a CBC series that is in fact not aired. So this was going to be part of my presentation tonight, because I thought you might find it interesting to see how radio documentaries are actually put together, to see how the music and the acting and the script works together with the text. And this was our plan. Well, 8 weeks of a lockout meant that we lost all this studio time. We don't have all our scripts ready, and naturally we haven't gone to air. But we will be going to air, the executive producer tells me, I believe, sometime in January. They're currently airing the Massey lectures with Stephen Lewis, which got backlogged again because of the strike. The title, and it's always is important, is the title, of course, Stalking the Holy, actually comes from Jacques Goulet. Jacques Goulet was the past president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion and professor emeritus at Mount St. Vincent University. And he saw me there when I was giving the Elizabeth Seton lectures in year 2000. And he said, there's that Higgins stalking the holy. And I thought, that's a great phrase, you know. That's all Jacques' good for, but the phrase, I love the phrase. And so I recorded in my head, I'm going to use this for something somewhere down the line. So I kept the phrase. No intention of writing a book about the saints. My executive producer, who comes up with these ideas, same with the Jesuit Mystique, who's Jewish, says to me, I'm very interested in saints. We're going to commission you to write a series and write a book on the saints. Well, I don't really want to write a book about, you're writing a book about the saints. Good, we're working on the saints. And the same thing happened with the Jesuit Mystique. I love the idea of Jesuits, but you're Jewish. But I love the idea of Jesuits, and I think you should do a series called the Jesuit Mystique. I'm not so crazy about the Jesuit Mystique. It is fine, Bernie. It just is not possible to resist them. So, Stalking the Holy has become both the book and the series. And what we've done, and what I want to give you just a glimpse of tonight, is something about what we mean by the process of sainting and the shifting paradigms or models or icons of holiness. And I want to look specifically at 3 case studies. There's Padre Pio di Pietrelcina, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. Now, the reason for that is that each one of them represents a particular phase in the process of sainting in the Roman Communion. So Pius XII is servant of God. His cause has been introduced. His cause is, as you know, extremely controversial. The cause was, interestingly, not introduced by John Paul II, which is often thought to be the case. It was introduced by Pope Paul VI at the same time as John the 23rd at the end of the council. So there's that. Then the second one is Mother Teresa is beatified. Okay, so she's Blessed Mother Teresa. And Padre Pio is sainted. He's Saint Pio. So it was looking at each one of these cases and examining, in every single instance, the controversies associated with this process. It's not perhaps what you think. Somebody sits down and says, there's a great-looking saint. We'll move on that one. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. If it did, well, there'd be millions more saints than there are. Okay? Part of the process, of course, is the official unfolding. So we're going to look at that, but first of all, just to set a little bit of the context. Novelist, essayist, and screenwriter Ron Hansen put it neatly when he says that the hunger of our spirits is fed by sharing in the glimpsed interiority of others. Hansen's a great figure. I don't know if you know him, but he's the author of several books, the most recent, Hitler's Niece, a very disturbing work coming out of the pre-Reich period, coming out of the Reich period, and very powerfully evocative of not only the period, but the controversies in ethics. He also, I got to know him. I interviewed him directly for the series. I know him because years ago I got a script, and this is beside the point, but it's not entirely. I got a script from his agent asking me to be the consultant for the Hollywood film that he had just worked on, and it was being shot in Toronto. Many Hollywood films actually are not shot in Hollywood, as I'm sure you know. They're shot in studios in Toronto. So I got and I was asked to be the consultant for a film called Merton in Ecstasy. So I said to the agent, well, I don't like the title very much. You know, this isn't pornography, is it? And they said, well, no, it's not pornography. And I said, why don't you send me the script? And they sent me the script. Before the script arrived, I went down to our chief librarian at the time, Dr. Gary Draper, and I said to me, find out what you know about this Ron Hansen before the script arrives. So he did, and he came back and he said, okay, boss, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is it's not pornography, okay? The bad news is he writes westerns. I thought, oh my God, I'm a consultant for a western. I mean, I've only seen pictures of horses. What am I going to do with this? Well, the script arrived. It's the story of Saint Thérèse Martin, Thérèse de Lisieux, but updated, put in a slightly different context with all the ambivalence and the suffused spirituality and eroticism that you would expect of a postmodern treatment, but beautifully articulated, poetically laced, and profound. So profound, in fact, that Hollywood wouldn't air it. We shot the film in Toronto. It went back the rushers went back to Hollywood, and the producer said, no, we can't show this film. Because part of the problem was, did she or did she not have the stigmata, or the wounds, the signature of Christ on her body? Well, Hansen doesn't allow you to know. You have to draw your own conclusion from her personality and from the text and from the film. It's magnificently done, but it's deliberately ambivalent. Well, the producers said, oh, we can't do this. It's too European. People have to know, does she or doesn't she? Okay? He said, but that's not the point. He says, it's the point for an American audience. An American audience will not buy into ambiguity and into ambivalence. And they said, well, we will not compromise on the film. And so the film was never aired. It's really sad, actually. It was a wonderful cast. Eva Marie Saint actually fittingly, plays the role of Mother Superior in the convent. John Mahoney from, what's that television series? Fraser, right, plays the priest, plays the doctor, father. The priest is played by Rutger Hauer, who spent hours trying to situate himself into pre-modernist France. Interestingly, the Hollywood people were so alarmed by this that they asked the film not to be set in Quebec. Hansen sets in Quebec with a fictitious order, and they insisted that it be in the States, so he sets it in a French community in northern Maine. Okay, as close as he can get. Anyway, that's quite an aside, I know. But if you get a chance to read Marietta in Ecstasy, do so, and you won't have to do it in a brown paper bag. We are drawn to the lives of the saints because they give us access to their inner struggles, to their defeats and to their triumphs. Imitation may be the supreme form of flattery, but it can be deadly with the saints. Think of martyrs. Catholics have been exhorted to aspire to sainthood for a long time. On the road to holiness are the saints, and they are there for Catholics to imitate, venerate, and invoke. I should say at this point again, canonization is not a uniquely Roman Catholic undertaking. Anglicans and the Orthodox also canonize in their manner. Okay? And holy women and men can be found in every faith tradition. So when I'm talking about this particular model or paradigm of holiness and the sainting process in the Roman Communion, it is unique to the Roman Communion in that this process has been defined by centuries of practice and theological and juridical reflection. But the idea of having saints, out of acknowledging saints, of recognizing holy women and men in the tradition is not something that only Roman Catholics do by any stretch of the imagination. Saints are more than travel guides to the kingdom, and they are more than travel agents to the other world. All Roman Catholics, indeed all Christians, are called to sainthood, and many indeed are saints. But only a handful are officially recognized as such. This process of sainting involves several steps, but the ultimate one, the final one, is known as canonization, which means adding to the canon or the list those officially declared as God's intimate companions. In some cases, canonization can follow fairly quickly after beatification. This was true with Saint Jose Maria Escriva y Balaguer, the founder of Opus Dei, and also true to a considerable degree, I suspect, though the final process has yet to be concluded, with Mother Teresa. And by quickly, I can mean a few years or a multiple of decades, or in the case of Joan of Arc and Thomas More, many centuries. But in many other instances, the beatified, the beati, get to enjoy their interim status for an indeterminate period of time, depending upon the time, the Pope and the saintly candidate's lobbying apparatus. The time for beatification can be considerably longer than that which elapses between the penultimate stage and the ultimate stage. Cardinal Newman, for instance, has been lingering for quite a while, and several get to a certain point in the stages of the sainting process, and they stay there forever. Or for, well, I guess if you're a saint, forever doesn't really mean anything, but you're kind of stuck there. So, but if you're watching it, I've often thought, if you're watching from heaven, what must you be thinking? Like your people aren't doing a very good job down there advocating on your behalf. Okay, there are certain deficiencies. Does it mean you're a lesser quality than the other ones who actually made it? Under Pope John Paul II, candidates for officially recognized holiness have streamlined and accelerated process. In fact, under John Paul II, there were more people beatified and sainted than all previous popes combined. Okay? In the 26 years, Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, beatified, canonized, and introduced the causes of more saints than every single pope in history combined. Take all the other 266 or whatever, and you still don't end up with the same number. So this was a big thing for John Paul II, and there are reasons for that. The allure of the saint candidate is to be found, in my view, in the drama of his or her life, and not in the licity or validity of the cause. And that's why I have found that fiction writers understand this process better than the canonists or the lawyers. Quoting Hansen again, I am not sure I know what heroic sanctity is anymore, because all of my favorite saints are so flawed that when you examine their lives in a particular way, you know they're not going to become saints. I think that a lot of the biographies of the saints, the often maligned hagiographies, that we had in the past painted the saints in such a way that we only had inconsequential peccadillos to address. I think, however, that the saints have a general kind of angst gnawing away at them that they must battle all the time. My only problem with saints as they're made today is that the process is very selective, whereas the populace at large has a very clear idea about who the saints are: Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Mother Teresa, the slaughtered Jesuits of El Salvador, Oscar Romero. We know that if you did a devil's advocate examination of these people's lives, you would always find something that will compromise their heroic sanctity. For instance, Thomas Merton appears to have had an affair in the monastery, not a great thing, and Dorothy Day had an abortion. Okay, so these kinds of things hang in the background, and they complicate the cause. Certainly the people that we made saints in the early centuries were more often not judged in how they lived at the end of their lives, not as they were as youths. I think, and certainly this is true of Day and Merton, that too much attention is paid to youthful indiscretions or to moments of bleakness or despair in middle age. This is problematic to me. That's because Ron Hansen is in middle age. This is problematic for most moderns, to say nothing of most postmoderns. The canonization process that Hansen has difficulties with has evolved over the centuries, and some of the most radical changes in the history of canonization have actually been made in the last 20 years. I don't know if people realize that, but in 1983, John Paul II rewrote the rules of canonization. You've heard, everyone in this room has heard the phrase, the advocatus diaboli, the devil's advocate. Yeah, we often hear that phrase. The devil's advocate doesn't exist anymore. In 1983, it got expunged. Okay, not a happy thing. And there are various scholars that think this is a big mistake because they like the old adversarial role. You know, somebody's promoting the cause for sainthood, but there's somebody out there looking out in the interest of the devil. Right? Say, okay, yeah, well, he's pretty saintly, but do you remember when, he was accused of graft and larceny and, So there's always, the devil's advocate's role was always to keep this in check. It was an adversarial or juridical model. But John Paul II changed that. He turned it into an historical biographical system so that it was more research-oriented. And so there's a great deal of time involved in the preparation of what we call the positios, or those substantive documents that chronicle the life and assess the work of the candidate. Canonization in its own way, according to Brooklyn-born Monsignor Roberto Sarno of the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints, makes clear, is actually one of the earliest democratic processes in the Church. He observed at one point that, first and foremost, the cause of canonization must be understood as a process of discernment, whereby the Church discerns what the Holy Spirit is doing in the Church itself. Mother Teresa of Calcutta used to say that she is a pencil in the hand of God. Well, no one really cares about the pencil. What they care about is the message that the pencil is writing, what God is trying to say through these holy individuals. End of quote. But how do you determine which pencil gets recognition? The sainting process is more than an institutional hurdle. It is an historical unfolding. Stalking the Holy involves more than intellectual curiosity, more than the plodding reconstruction of a life, the detailed calibration of fact with argument. It involves an openness to the unnerving task of following the lineaments and contours of holiness, not only in the other, but in oneself as mirrored in the other. These others are those that the Canadian novelist Leonard Cohen calls in his novel Beautiful Losers the balancing monsters of love. That's Cohen's phrase. Now, the appeal of St. Pio di Pietrelcina cannot be found in his systematic teaching, for there isn't any. It cannot be found in the wild heroics of a missionary's witness, for he never left Italy for hostile shores, or for that matter, any shores. He never left Italy, he virtually never left his village. It cannot be found in bold strategies of reform, for he initiated none, and in fact he resisted reform coming from the council. It cannot be found in his influence in the chambers of power, for even the Vatican marginalized him for a time. And it cannot be found in his bracing contemporaneity, for his devotional life and ecological perspective remained rooted in an earlier time. So where lies the appeal? I don't know if you've been to Italy, but if you've been to Italy, you'll see a picture of Padre Pio in most homes, in restaurants, everywhere. He's the most beloved Italian property since Francis of Assisi. St. Pio di Pietrelcina matters enormously. He defines something visceral about Italy, about its imagination, about its religious sensibility, about its connectedness with the land. To understand St. Pio is to understand something about Italy and the Italian imagination. It's extraordinary. Outside of Italy, he has a huge, huge following. And all kinds of people you would expect to be fairly cynical or suspicious about a pious Capuchin. People like Graham Greene, who would define himself as an agnostic Catholic, always carried in his pocket a relic of Pio de Pietrelcina. All kinds of people, politicians and people who would never admit in public to having any interest in the Roman Catholic Church or Jesus of Nazareth, but have a huge interest in St. Pio de Pietrelcina. Now, how is it possible then? What happened? And it's also interesting, and this is a pattern you see again and again. The Vatican didn't like Pio de Pietrelcina. Okay? Almost from the beginning. You will recall that in the year 1918, at the end of the war, he received the stigmata. Okay? Not, I guess, Teresa Neumann. Neumann is the other great 20th century stigmatic. There aren't very many, in spite of Hollywood's effort to put a stigmatic on every street. There actually are very few stigmatics, and that's a good thing. It's not you don't want a proliferation of stigmatics. But he received the stigmatic at the end of 1918. He carried it on his body until he died in 1968. Now, what is really interesting is, and I believe me, I'm completely on the Vatican side in this, the Vatican doesn't like this kind of stuff, this paranormal business and whatnot. This is problematic, all right? And the Vatican investigated Padre Pio regularly throughout his career. There were allegations of sexual misconduct, various forms of skullduggery, venality, manipulation of the books, and accounts. He was considered to be a masterful fundraiser. And there were all kinds of efforts to actually tape confessions in the confessional to bug them. They even, at the Vatican, even at one point, appointed a medical doctor, Gemelli. You may know that name because of the Gemelli Polyclinic in Rome, which is one of the great hospitals in Italy. It's named after a Capuchin friar who was also a medical doctor, a very distinguished medical doctor, and the Vatican appointed him to conduct the investigation into Padre Pio. And he concluded rather negatively that he was a fraud. And so there were debates and fights over Padre Pio for most of his life. He was virtually only vindicated near the end of his life. So, given the controversies, given the nature of his piety, rural, Italian, basically 19th century, how is it that in the 21st century there is a thriving cult of St. Pio? Well, Pio's simple spirituality is simple, and it is unadorned. Like Thérèse de Lisieux, with her little way, spirituality, Pio offers a homespun spirituality that is accessible, non-threatening, non-elitist. It's about as democratic as you get. There's no complicated regimen here, no initiation into a quasi-Gnostic text. It's for everyone. Marked by its populism and its non-esoteric regimen for spiritual enlightenment. Rustic, humble, and simple it is, like Pio himself. A rural Italian invention fully consonant with the Franciscan tradition and unabashedly visceral. Many fellow Capuchins found Pio's spirituality unattractive, too unsophisticated, too earthy, and too raw for the more refined Franciscan palates. But to get to know the real Pio is to entail a reevaluation of the friar's life and faith. Padre Pio was a Capuchin. John Corvo, the general minister of the Capuchins at the time of Padre Pio's canonization, and very interestingly, a Canadian, met with us and the CBC crew when we were in Rome. And I remember on one particular occasion asking him in a very forthright way, once we had turned off the tape and the machines and whatnot, I said, okay, tell me, boys, do you really buy this stuff? The bilocation, the aroma, the blood, and everything else? Is that why we're canonizing this man? The big interest in the supernatural? They looked at me as if I had two heads. And they said, look, the reason why the Vatican is canonizing him is entirely different from the reason we are. We want him canonized because he represents the utter freedom that comes from powerlessness. He understood, perhaps better than any Franciscan since St. Francis, what it means to be powerless. And because he eschewed power, because he refused to be seduced by it, because he allowed the only power in his life to be love, the rest of it doesn't matter. He is a threat to Rome, and Rome's way of canonizing him and defining his sainthood is a way of legitimating him. I thought that was extraordinary. And what it does is to underscore again the complex motivations and factors that go into play in any sainting. The perfect example, of course, I haven't got time for this right now, but a perfect example is the fascination with Joan of Arc. She has her own fan club. She's got several websites. There's a rock band named after her. Okay, she's the darling of every monarchist in France. Jean-Marie Le Pen and the fascists, they think she's great. All the feminists have claimed Joan of Arc as theirs. Okay, everybody's got a bit of Joan. All right, now how does this happen? Okay, I suppose in a way this is one of the reasons why Bernie asked me to look into these celestial celebrities, because our whole culture is run on the need for celebrities and icons. Right? Just think of how long it takes you to get to your news now in your broadcasts on television. Okay, you have mostly portraits and profiles of celebrities. When do you? A perfect example to me was when Doug Letson and I were in Los Angeles many years ago. Joe Sinisak was there at a church press conference, and there was some problem in the Middle East. Well, there's always a problem in the Middle East, but the Los Angeles Times, which is along with the New York Times and the Washington Post, one of the three principal papers in the United States, sent a reporter to interview, along with a television company, Mel Gibson, get Mel Gibson's view on the political situation in the Middle East. Now, this predates the Passion, so he's not even thinking about that yet. Okay, so he's out there, and I thought, isn't this extraordinary? It's commentary mediated through celebrity. There's no competence, there's no particular insight, there's certainly no profundity, but the authority that comes from the position as celebrity. Well, are our saints celestial celebrities? Are they caught in the same kind of spin? How do we look at this? Here's what Father Corrival said about Padre Pio. I think it's extraordinarily insightful. So he says, both Pio and Francis of Assisi had a tremendous devotion to Christ, and particularly the cross. In fact, for Francis, the two key mysteries in the life of Jesus that touched him deeply were the crib and the cross. They were interconnected realities. Francis preached that the Word of the Most High God took flesh in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and yet he does not see the Incarnation as a Christological event so much as a manifestation of the humility of God the Creator. Humility is at the heart of everything that you touch in Francis. The power to change the world resides in humility, and for that reason, when he gave his identity to his order, he said that he wanted them to be called the Lesser Brothers, il poverello, the powerless brothers, because in their very powerlessness they could change the world. He said that the brothers should exercise no power among themselves, that they should hold no position of authority in either the church or in society. You remember, those of you who know the story of Francesco de Bernardoni, that he never sought the priesthood. He was never ordained. Because the only authentic instrument of change in the world can be discovered in the powerlessness or humility of God. That's an extraordinary concept. And we think of God, God's omniscience, God's omnipotence, but not God's humility. This is the same with Padre Pio. He reminds us, like Francis, we must go back to our roots and discover how it is possible to serve without power. Pio is an interpretation of the life of Francis for our time. Pio never held a position of authority in the Capuchin order, not even as a local superior or vicar of a house. He stands as a sign of contradiction in a world dedicated to control. Interestingly, he received the stigmata in the final year of the Great War. In the very midst of acts of great and deadly and futile arrogance, with nations seeking to impose their will on others, there emerged in a hillside in Italy this figure of humility, this figure who bore visibly the sign of the cross, the sign of divine humility itself on his very person. End of quote. Now that's not sentimental Christianity. But Catholics themselves are divided over the Pio legacy. He is not the founder of a new religious body. He did not hold high ecclesiastical office. He did not suffer martyrdom at the hands of the persecutors of the Church, or indeed at the hands of the Church. He did not establish a new system of theological or philosophical thought, and he did not contribute a major body of spiritual reflection to the community. In other words, he would not be eligible for promotion at St. Jerome's faculty. He lived simply, bled amply, pretty well a pint a day, counseled untold numbers in the confessional. At one point, people were required to take numbered tickets and could wait up to 2 months before their confessional time slot. It's hard for us to imagine there was a time when confession was hot. You get a ticket to line up for 2 months to go to confession. It's unbelievable. He read into the deepest recesses of the soul, reputedly engaged in paranormal activities with the greatest of reluctance. Thank God for that. Withstood relentless personal assaults on his integrity from critics and detractors in his order and from without, and he died a beloved legend. He was nothing exceptional, and yet, he captured the imagination and the heart of huge numbers of both the devout and the cynical. Conservatives in particular were drawn to him, and they came from across the denominational divide. In fact, one of his most important biographers was the Lutheran cleric C. Bernard Ruffin, who actually proclaims Padre Pio of Pietrelcina the Italian equivalent of Billy Graham or Oral Roberts. That would have not gone well down in the Vatican. At the same time that he is compared favorably with American televangelists, the darling of Pentecostals and charismatics everywhere, he becomes a rallying point for increasingly disaffected Catholics, distraught by post-conciliar directions that seem to them threatening to the Church's holiness of doctrine and practice. In fact, there's a Capuchin brother, Jean, of the monastery of Saint-François in Morgan, France, who drew succor from Pio's personal resistance to the many changes ushered in by the Council, and used Pio's fidelity to the old order as a tool to admonish modernizers. A strong defender of traditional morality, in fact, Padre Pio wrote to Pope Paul VI shortly before his own death, thanking him for Humanae Vitae, the 1968 papal encyclical that reaffirmed the ban against all forms of artificial birth regulation. Eventually, Rome grew tired of him and eventually capitulated, and they sent a delegate, Cardinal Bacci, to him to inform him that, in fact, he could say Mass according to the rite of St. Pius V, who was a 16th century pope, and his response was to say to the cardinal, for pity's sake, end the council quickly. In short, not a guy of the council. Okay? It is not alarming nor surprising, however, that a friar like Pio would be attached to the traditional way of celebrating the liturgy, and that he would find the new order of things distressful. Nor is it surprising, given his popularity throughout Italy, that he would be emboldened to seek dispensation from the Roman authorities. After all, he came to realize he was tradition. An examination of his spiritual teachings reveals an earnest body of fervent, uncomplicated traditional maxims and exhortations. Although his emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus might hint at a Protestant stratagem of bypassing the Church in the interest of salvation, nothing Pio did was outside his structured, visceral, and all-embracing Catholic world. His struggling, rugged, no-holds-barred Christianity appealed to Pope John Paul II long before his election to the papacy. Perhaps it was Pio's deep sense of victimhood and expiation, his utter trust in providence, his willingness to withstand persecution at the hands of uncomprehending authorities, and his steadfast focus on the unalterable truths of Catholicism that secured the Pope's attraction to the cult of Pio. Undoubtedly, John Paul II entertained none of the reservations about Padre Pio held by all his predecessors, save John Paul I. That means that Pope Benedict XV, Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, Pope John XXIII, and Pope Paul VI all had reservations that either brimmed over into deep distrust or remained mildly niggling suspicions. The only two who did not was John Paul II, who ruled for 26 years and had time to think about it, and Albino Luciani, who ruled for 28 days and didn't have much time to think about it. Only John Paul II then gave him a completely clean bin of health and provided him with the kind of pontifical endorsement that has seen him move through rehabilitation to sainthood at warp speed. Leonard Cohen's description of a saint as a monster of love certainly applies to Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, especially when you consider the etymology of monster. It's from the Latin, monstrum, which combines divine portent, or warning, with the marvelous. Well, the marvel is to be found not only in the paranormal, least of all in the paranormal, and more in the excess of love. And the warning? A beacon in the tumult, argue some Capuchins. A judgment on the corruption of power, ecclesiastical and secular, argue other Capuchins. In an age quickly unnerved by religious leaders and spiritual mentors hell-bent on bringing their followers to the doors of heaven, Padre Pio can sometimes be disquieting. The genius of Pio's pastorship, however, is to be found in his abjuring of power, his suffering at the hands of power, his steady conviction that he is a conduit of God's love. In the end, Padre Pio di Pietrelcina was a wholly subversive. So this anti-modern was, in his own wonderfully ironic way, a postmodern. Mother Teresa became in her lifetime a model of holiness that admitted of no redeeming vices. Fiercely obedient and fiercely demanding in obedience, driven, disinclined to nuance and compromise, contemptuous of political propriety and prepared to fix her sail to whatever ship of disrepute floated by, as long as in the end God's forsaken were touched by love. Mother Teresa is not that much different from other headstrong saints of the past, except that whereas many of the confessors, martyrs, and virtuous women of history have had their struggles with church officialdom, in fact nearly all of them, labored under the shadow of disapproval, and have known the bitter taste of failure and obscurity, Mother Teresa seemed to have the papal housekeeping seal of approval from the outset and basked in the rays of global affirmation. She was a star in her own time. And therein lies part of the problem. In addition, she could be a prick to an uneasy conscience. While many individuals, agencies, and governments either lacked the determination or resources to redress the egregious wrongs of society, or felt immobilized by the sheer magnitude of the task, Mother Teresa had no problem galloping in where a legion of angels dared not tread. She cajoled government officials, badgered diffident, if not exhausted relief workers, prodded religious women and men to make even greater sacrifices, connived with business and political leaders to get things done even as they sought to use her for some specious legitimacy, and insisted on controlling her media image. She had little time for theological and philosophical dissent, neither grasped nor indicated any desire to understand current issues like feminism, subscribed unconditionally to a traditionalist reading of the natural law theory, disregarded the determinative role of political ideologies in the shaping of systems and nations, and was passionate about only one industry: love of the poorest of the poor. That was her industry. Now, Mother Teresa's single-mindedness strikes her critics as willfulness and inflexibility, and her one fit meets all approach to begging. Got to remember that mendicancy is as much a venerable tradition in Christianity as it is in Hinduism, demonstrate a willingness to shake hands with the devil, should it be necessary to secure the level of support required to serve societies unloved. Germaine Greer and Christopher Hitchens, among others, see Mother Teresa as a calculating, empire-building, publicity-seeking, and power-loving nun. But her biographer, the Anglican, brilliant biographer, by the way, Catherine Spinks, sees her unbending purposefulness and willingness to do commerce with the unsavory in an entirely different light. Here's what Spinks says. She was certainly very aware of what God wanted, and if something was God's will, then there wasn't a great deal of compromise, and she could go out and get it done. I think that many of the criticisms coming from Christopher Hitchens and others center around her associations with people of power and finance who are considered of morally dubious character. She really believed that everyone should be given the opportunity to do good, and that should be as accessible as possible. She was not manipulative, but she was certainly determined to do what she believed was the will of God. She saw in every individual, regardless of whether they were prince, journalist, or pauper, the Christ whom she sought to serve. Many have accused her of pursuing publicity, so let me give you an example of how unimportant celebrity status was actually to her. When she received the Nobel Prize by the king, she was given some kind of medallion, and then she lost it right away in the cloakroom. She was indifferent to these tokens personally because all that mattered, all that was important, was the recognition these awards afforded the unacknowledged poor of the world and their, not her, needs. End of quote. Now, the argument that Mother Teresa suffers all the attention she receives, all the honors she accepts, and all the praise that she is accorded because it guarantees attention to the poor and martial support for their cause is not likely to persuade the cynical, the jaded, and the hostile. The fact that Mother Teresa does not decline the very many perks her high profile warrants in a celebrity-obsessed world doesn't help the case of her apologists that Mother is utterly detached from these perquisites and cares not a whit for her own comfort or for her personal prerogatives. For instance, although it is true that she flew first class, it is also true that this seating arrangement was made by the airlines in order to ensure her comfort and safety as well as prevent the disruptions and chaos that would follow once passengers in coach realized who was seated on their plane. Now, we all know what the people are like in the coach section. I thought this was a particularly snide observation, but what the heck. Now, this is a protocol. The people in the coach section are just always hovering on chaos, right? We're just this close to that thin line between civility and barbarism. So it only takes a little bit to push us over, and then we run into the first class. This is a protocol employed actually by most airlines when they are transporting a celebrity, any celebrity, and in and of itself does not betray a sinister and hidden luxury-loving penchant deep in the heart of Mother Teresa. Her celebrity status is, of course, the direct result of her relationship with the media, a relationship her critics dub exploitative and sophisticated in simplicity. Others, including the Canadian Jesuit, mass communication scholar, and long-time resident in India, Gaston Roberge, sees quite differently. He says, well, she wanted the media's help to make her known her work, which she called God's work. She needed the media for that. Did she go around focusing on life's miseries? Yeah, in a sense she did. But when there are millions of poor people, that's worth talking about, with force and conviction. Perhaps people thought that her image of poverty excluded them, but balanced pictures, they don't lead to action, and she understood that. Certainly she was selective, strategic in her use of the media, and she knew that in many ways she was their creation, but she was not enamored of the media. She did not court its favor, and she knew how intrusive the media can be. Mother Teresa's holiness is best situated not in her tradition-saturated ecclesiology, her conventional anthropology, her indifference to politics, or her unquestioning obedience to the all-demanding mission of service to the poorest of the poor. Rather, it's to be found in her, and I quote, authority of compassionate courage. It's a great phrase. An authority Dominican scholar Mary Catherine Hilkert argues places Mother Teresa in a varied crowd that includes the likes of Maya Angelou, Etty Hilson, Helen Prejean, Dorothy Day, Jane Goodall, and the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. An authority that emerged in part from the undeniable fact that they have known suffering in their own bodies, in their families and their countries, in the religious bodies to which they belong. Mother Teresa knew suffering intimately. In a time when many are skittish about claiming God's alliance with human projects, when the ominous theocratization of secular politics in both democratic and non-democratic regimes has many people frightened, when the invocation of God's blessing on crusades and jihads against causes, governments, and people judged as infidels or as apostates continues unabated, and in a time when the proliferation of ultra-conservative spokespersons in the media and through well-funding lobbying forces seems beyond termination, in a time such as this, Mother Teresa can look suspect. But was she one of them? Mother Teresa certainly damns her in the eyes of some. In the eyes of others, she represents either willingly or unintentionally a type of woman that is pre-modern. In the end, the ancient argument of the rabbi, if it is of God, it will flourish, and if not, it will die, applies conclusively to the reputation and witness of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And the odds in her favor, quite frankly, are impressive. Take, for instance, one man, Abdus Sattar Hedi, a contemporary Islamic saint. Hedi's work on behalf of the poor, sick, and abandoned of Karachi, Pakistan, is legendary. According to East European scholar and journalist Anatol Lieven, Hedi, with the support of his wife Bilquis, uses his fleet of ambulances to bury the unclaimed dead, establishes and funds a score of orphanages, a network of free dispensaries, a diabetes center, and homes for physically disabled children and abused women. And they do this husband and wife team, in the face of institutional indifference, social hostility from their economic class, and incomprehension from the large number of people who benefit from their love and their generosity. But they persist. Now listen to this. The highest praise accorded Mr. Eddy and his wife, but particularly him, in his own country is the noble tag, and I quote, Pakistan's Father Teresa. That says it all. A male, a Muslim Mother Teresa. Her sainthood is assured, embedded in a legacy of universal inspiration. It was the radical, to the final one now. It was the radical Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan who coined the phrase the icebox pope when describing Pope Pius XII. Daniel's never been known for his subtlety. Pictured to the world as a remote, indeed august figure of aristocratic bearing, legitimate as it happens, he was indeed an aristocrat, looking so severe and ascetic, so saintly, that is, that Catholics throughout the world saw him as a distant approximation of divinity. Well, sort of. But Pius was not a priest you easily loved, and he seemed to prefer it that way. Berrigan caught the sympathy of a generation with his phrase, and it remains for many an apt way of describing the princely Eugenio Pacelli. But is it really? Certainly 2 decades after Berrigan first used his less than flattering term, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio personality Erica Ritter spoke openly and derisively of Pius when she observed on her radio program that in her school classroom in Saskatchewan, Pius's official photograph hung on the wall like a judgment on them all. Pius, the imperious servant of the servants of God. Pius, the ever-watchful Pontifex Maximus. Well, this man was Pope from 1939 until 1958, and for many years after his death, his legacy remained largely unstained. Boring, in fact. A legacy not unlike that of many modern popes, of blessed memory, sanitized, sacralized, non-controversial, and all of a piece with predecessors worthy and otherwise. Shirley Williams, one-time cabinet minister in the Labour government of Great Britain, Harvard professor emerita, and co-founder of the Social Democratic Party, recalls her impression of Pius dating from her encounter with him as a child. She said, "In 1950, my father and I went to Rome together to celebrate the Holy Year. The great church of St. Peter was ablaze with candles, and one could feel it emerging from the darkness of the war years and of the Nazi period before that. We had a private audience with the Pope, Pius XII. Refined and frail, he seemed almost translucent in his gold and white vestments. At that time, before controversy bruised his reputation, he appeared almost saint-like, removed in his spirituality from the horrors of the secular world." End of quote. Well, it didn't take long before the horrors of the secular world would invade his sanctuary and significantly tarnish his reputation. It began in 1962-63 with the appearance of the scabrous, incendiary, ahistorical, but extraordinarily powerful drama The Representative, or The Deputy, by the German playwright Wolf Hochhuth. For Michael Maris, the Holocaust Studies professor at the University of Toronto, argues that this is not the right time to be advancing the case for Pacelli's sainthood. This is what he says. "I think that any discussion of this possibility must begin with reference to Pope John XXIII and to the great changes ushered in by the Second Vatican Council of 1962-65. This council began a process which I believe is irreversible, but a process that nonetheless is going to take time. You cannot turn around the culture or the disposition of a church with 1 billion members, international in scope, with many different national points of departure, culturally and intellectually and so forth. You simply can't turn around views in a very short and condensed period of time. Nor can Jewish views, lacking as they do any sort of coherent or central animating institutional focus like the papacy, turn around suddenly. Add to this the fact that the reality that the Jewish people have suffered an assault, the genocidal attack of the Nazis, which is simply unprecedented historically, and which I think has created a wound that will take a long time to heal. And how could it be otherwise? All of us are still coming to terms with the Holocaust. This is a process of progressive understanding that began with John the 23rd and was carried forward admirably and extraordinarily by John Paul II. This is a process, and I think that we need to keep in mind that total transformation of attitude and view can only be envisaged by utopians. All that acknowledged, I have to say that the sainting of Pius XII, in my view, is not entirely helpful, coming as it does at a time when we are still in the process of coming to terms with the insufficiencies of Vatican policy during the war. Oh, yes, we may say that it is wrong to criticize Pope Pius XII using 21st century hindsight, that does not make sense. But on the other hand, any objective assessment will have to recognize that there were extraordinary insufficiencies, that there were things not done, there were options that were not taken, a prophetic voice that was not heard, etc. So when Jews think about a saint, they conventionally think of someone who has risen above an ordinary level of standing to act in an exemplary way, who has served as an exemplary demonstration of the kind of person who responds in an exceptional way in exceptional circumstances. Pius XII, whatever else one can say of him, does not, in my view, as an historian, rise to that level. But I should add, very quickly, that Roosevelt does not rise to that level, nor even Churchill, who had the deepest awareness of all of what was happening to European Jewry, who was the most philo-Semitic of all the world leaders on the stage at the time. Even Churchill doesn't make that standard. So as you can see, Jews have a tough time with the contention that Pius XII is a saint, although I hasten to add that this is really none of my business. I am no locus standing in the debate, but friends owe it to friends to speak honestly. I think that Jews are appreciative of the directions that the Catholic Church has taken on Jewish issues, but we have some obligation to say to Catholics who are involved in this sainting process that we don't get it. It doesn't seem right. It doesn't make sense. And perhaps the better part of wisdom would be to postpone this action for another time, waiting for more information, for more knowledge, more background, more documentation, simply put, for a deeper understanding on all our sides. End of quote. Now, without question, Catholics and Jews are divided on the wisdom of proceeding with the cause of Eugenio Pacelli, but not universally so. There are Jews who are very well disposed to Pius XII, including the foremost Holocaust historian in the world and the definitive biographer of Churchill, Sir Martin Gilbert, but also Rabbi David Dalen out of New York. There are Jews, however, in Maris's words, who are overtly hostile to any move on the Church's part to defend the record of Pius during these war years. More significantly, however, and this we need to pay attention to, there is a very deep chasm that exists among Catholics themselves over the reputation, legacy, saintliness, and political savvy of Pacelli, with those on one side fiercely defensive of the Pope, and those on the other side adamant in their opposition to any and all efforts at rehabilitation. In addition, Catholics have staked out positions that, although explicitly about Pius, the Jews, and the Holocaust, are implicitly about competing views of the papacy and church reform. Far more than was the case with either Saint Padre Pio or Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Roman Catholic opinion, popular, official, and scholarly, is severely discordant on the matter of Pius's cause, not only in terms of timeliness and historical sensitivity, but also in terms of the essential merits of the cause itself and of the theological and ecclesiological fallout guaranteed to follow formal conferral of sainthood. After all, it was John Paul II, the very Pope who inaugurated the new millennium with the liturgy of purification of memory, who has been steadfast in his support of Father Peter Gumpo, the German relator who is responsible for the case for the cause of Pius XII. Gumpo is the Pacelli supporter par excellence, and no advance would be made were it not for his commitment. At the same time, no greater progress has been made on Jewish-Catholic relations than during the pontificate of the Polish Pope. Father Gumpo is proceeding apace. Controversy continues unabated. Apologists and critics alike refuse to temper their inflammatory rhetoric. Moderates feel unheard or sidelined. And in the words of an editorial in the Toronto-based Catholic Register, we have all had enough of intellectual thuggery masquerading as history. The politics of saint-making calls for a solid dose of pastoral wisdom and a courageous injection of papal diplomacy. In my view, shelve the cause for at least a generation. Various factors mitigate against such a development, however, and they include the German Pope Benedict XVI recognizes that his predecessor's commitment to the Pacelli cause did not jeopardize his high standing in the Jewish community, nor his commitment to the purification of memory, and that by proceeding with the sainting process he will honor the memory of John Paul II at the same time that he acknowledges the Church's need to address its past. Disaffected Catholics who either recall personally or via a mediated nostalgia the heady days of Catholic triumphalism prior to John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council era are likely to be at least partly mollified by the canonization of a pope who represents the high peak of Catholic self-confidence. It is a propitious time to stem the secular scapegoating of Pius XII as the weak leader during the Second World War, and for setting the historical record straight now that both his great ideological enemies, Nazism and communism, have been effectively ground to dust. And the Vatican has invested so much energy, time, and personnel in defending its wartime record that the pullback now may be easily construed as either acknowledgement of the weakness of the Pacelli cause or as cowardice in the face of aggressive lobbying tactics. But in my view, if Pacelli is one of the Church's monsters of love, and I do believe him to be a man of natural holiness, by the way, recognition of this holiness has been sabotaged by the embattled polemics over his silence. A new purification of memory is needed now. To conclude, perhaps art critic and writer John Bentley May said it best in his Civitas Mundi column when he observed, and I quote, "I find it reassuring that so many cranky, blundering people have become saints. Maybe there's hope for me. After all, sainthood is not about being nice. It's a matter of saying yes to divine love so often you simply forget how to say anything else." End of quote. But how do we say yes to divine love at the beginning of the 21st century? And what are the personal and communal costs of that yes? In his best-selling book, The Heart of Christianity, Marcus Borg identifies the Celtic notion of thin places as non-specific geographically, as places where our hearts are opened, a sacrament, a channel of grace. Indeed, saints known and unknown, Christian and non-Christian, were and are thin places. But we most directly encounter the saints through that ancient of human endeavors, storytelling. In fact, as Kenneth Woodward, the American scholar who's written, in many ways, the foundational book on making saints, would have it, storytelling is a form of canonizing. He says, and I quote, "Those involved in the process by which saints are recognized should appreciate that canonization is a form of storytelling. It locates the life of a saint, itself a form of narrative, within the wider story of God's grace. In this respect, the Catholic imagination still, however, tends to produce impossibly pious biographies of the saints, including, I must say, many of the posizios produced by the congregation itself. Who can identify with a figure who never committed serious sin? Which is the implication in nearly all of the posizios that I have read." End of quote. Well, the squeamishness of dealing with less than immaculate dossiers of less than immaculate lives underscores the contorted attitude of officialdom when it comes to chronicling the lives of the saints. Take sex, for instance. As soon as it comes into the picture, officials are sent scattering in all directions, rationalizing its presence as if this is the power that can undo everything. Only the most antiseptic, fully laundered and emasculated, in the gender-free sense of that term, of posizios ever actually move forward. And even the hint of a sexual scandal, an affair, or a less than Manichaean approach to pleasure can seriously jeopardize the requisite gravitas of a case and compromise the possibilities of success. Peter Gumpel provides a perfect illustration, if unwittingly, of the Vatican's skittishness when it comes to sex, the case of Salvatore d'Acquisto. He says the following: "My Jesuit confrere, Dr. Paolo Marinari," Paolo Marinari, by the way, if you ever get a chance to do any of this kind of work, ever meet a really sophisticated, suave Jesuit Italian Jesuit of tremendous elegance and insight. He's recently in The Economist of London been arguing for the elimination of miracles in the sainting process. So remarkable man. But he works with Father Gumpel. He's the chief postulator. Anyway, Dr. Marinali, along with the chief commander of the Carabinieri and myself, that's the police force, were invited to respond to a television program aired on the state radio RAI, that's public broadcasting in Italy, owned by the same guy who owns all the private broadcasting in Italy. Sergio Berlusconi. Okay. But anyway, RAI, that purported to deal with the life of an heroic member of the Carabinieri during the German occupation of Italy. A young officer by the name of Salvatore d'Acquisto offered his own life to spare his others, to spare the life of his troop. Evidently, an attack against the Germans resulted in their determination to exact revenge by executing 22 innocent civilians. This prompted d'Acquisto to step forward and accept responsibility, although he knew nothing of the incident, because he thought it best that he be the sacrifice necessary to spare the 22 family men. The Germans obliged. The RAI film demeans d'Acquisto by showing him in bed with a woman. He is represented as a woman chaser, when he in fact was a very pure man who went to communion daily. The commander, Molinari, and I were outraged, and we were part of a 2-hour interview to counter the false claims of the film. That's Gumpel. Here's my reflection on this. Gumpel and the others have every right to be outraged by the misrepresentation of facts. It does nobody any good. By the sensationalizing of d'Acquisto's love life, and by the egregious introduction of juicy fiction to embellish the story. That would happen in Italian cinema, but not in Canadian, of course. At the same time, Gumpel and his associates may well have missed the real point in this. D'Acquisto's flesh and blood life, his sexual struggles and tensions, and spiritual conflicts are the actual stuff of interest. As their exclusion from the narrative drains the lifeblood out of the positio. As writer Ben Ockery aphoristically notes in his book A Way of Being Free, and I quote, "The fact of storytelling hints at a fundamental human unease. It hints at human imperfection. Where there is perfection, there is no story to tell." End of quote. The saints are not perfect. That's why they're not boring. How did we manage to morph them into the most boring gallery of individuals imaginable? Their stories should be interesting, were they not so frequently sanitized. In fact, they can be interesting even when they don't exist. As Eamon Duffy baldly remarks, Duffy is professor of ecclesiastical history at Cambridge University in England, one of the most distinguished public intellectuals, Catholic intellectuals in England. He says, in a fairly recent book, he said, "A staggering number of the figures who have evoked the most passionate veneration and the most elaborate and popular of cults have in fact been entirely fictitious, or at least no more than a name round which legend congealed. These include some of the most celebrated figures in the calendar, whose images and legends have inspired countless great works of art. Agatha, Barbara, Catherine of Alexandria, Crispin, not Richard Crispin, but Crispin, Christopher, George, Susanna, Philomena. The list seems endless. They never existed." Now, those were the old days. Or were they? The canonization of Juan Diego in July of 2002, a Mexican Indian of the 16th century on whose cloak was miraculously imprinted an image that became known as Our Lady of Guadalupe, provoked a controversy around the paucity of documentation attesting his very existence. Historians, ecclesiastics, anthropologists, and theologians all waded in, arguing the comparative merits of moving forward with a case of dubious authenticity. One historian, with the wonderful name of Fernando Cervantes, of Bristol University, argued that since Juan Diego failed to meet the requirements of historicity, meaning he didn't exist, as laid down by the Congregation of Saints itself, the credibility of the entire canonization process was going to be called into question. But David Brading, professor of Mexican history at Cambridge University and the author of the definitive study Mexican Phoenix, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Image and Tradition Across 5 Centuries, more sagely concluded that, and here's his quote, "As Mary is the type of the Church, so Juan Diego is the type, the symbolic, representative figure of all the Indians whose devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe brought them into the Mexican Church." Period. In other words, Juan Diego's story, Juan Diego as story, is compelling, efficacious, and deeply meaningful. A few years ago, we had a meeting. I sit on the Administrative Council of the International Federation of Catholic Universities in Paris, and we had a meeting in Mexico City at Universidad Iberoamericana, which is part of a consortium of five Jesuit universities in Mexico. The presidents were taken to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I remember asking our host, a very distinguished theologian, about the magnitude and importance of Guadalupe, and he said, look, in order to understand Mexico, you need to understand this. Mexicans are Guadalupists first and Catholics second. That's our history. And so by taking Juan Diego and canonizing what may have been a composite, what may have been a type, was actually much more adept and adroiter move pastorally than many people think. And so we have all our stories of mundane and ordinary holiness that shine incandescently in our own lives, right? We all know saints. We may live with one, though it may not be pleasant.